Welcome to Sci-Fi Quantum Archives. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and explore. She stood on the departure tier with her arms folded behind her back, not in arrogance, not in rebellion, but as ritual demanded. Behind her, the core envoys whispered last-minute directives, pressing data slates into her palm with nervous precision. She didn't glance at them. She had already memorized the cultural packet weeks ago. Earth. Species 037. Terrans. Known anomalies. Expressive instability, violent nostalgia, obsession with identity. Known threats 0. Known relevance, uncertain. A subtle chime marked her final clearance. No farewell gesture was exchanged. Not a blink. Not a breath. Her kind did not indulge in theatrical departures. Emotion was archived, not exhibited. The transit chamber hummed. A low, steady vibration beneath her boots, as the launch corridor aligned with the jump corridor. Her transport vessel was shaped in accordance with function alone. No curvature. No polish. The design language of a people who never expected to impress anyone. It rose behind her, tall and featureless. She walked forward without hesitation, stepping into silence. The jump was uneventful because it was supposed to be. The Andari didn't believe in unnecessary motion, unnecessary light, or unnecessary sound. Every element of the journey was calibrated to remove sensation. So when she arrived in orbit around Earth, she did not comment on the color of the oceans, the lights of the cities, or the uneven lattice of land below. She observed, recorded, analyzed. Her assignment was clear. Evaluate human cultural development. Assess its trajectory. Return with a comprehensive breakdown. She was not authorized to interfere. She was not required to admire. Earth, according to Andari academia, was a containment field of emotional entropy. Their languages suffered from semantic drift. Their governments changed with the wind. They constructed entire mythologies around temporary feelings and elevated sound into ritual. On the academic plane, it was an anomaly. On the psychological one, it was an embarrassment. Her file on Earth had been flagged for revision 3 times, not because it was inaccurate, but because no one agreed on whether it was worth classifying at all. The report she carried with her used phrases like emotionally undisciplined, aesthetic overconcentration, inconsistent moral frameworks. Yet the deeper she read, the more the numbers didn't align with the tone. A species this unstable should have collapsed by now. Instead, they had pushed further. Not with grace, not with unity, but with something else. Something the report never named. As she descended into the stratosphere, she noted the curvature of the atmosphere, the burnished edge of heat against hull plating, the delayed sonic layer that rippled around the shell. She was not impressed, but she was attentive. It was not her place to be moved. It was her place to know. Landing permissions had been granted weeks in advance. Diplomatic channels had been rehearsed. Every human involved had memorized the greeting script. She did not return the smile of the man waiting at the foot of the ramp. She did not blink at the flags. She did not flinch at the sudden burst of wind that pressed Earth's air against her skin. But something inside her paused, not in confusion, not in resistance. Just a stillness that wasn't protocol. She looked across the landing platform and saw movement without symmetry. Children watching from a distance. Their shoes mismatched. Their mouths open. Someone in the crowd shouted something unintelligible, and the humans laughed. Not with mockery, not with cruelty, just a sudden unfiltered outburst. She tilted her head slightly, logging the sound. She had heard laughter described. In reports. In simulations. In training loops. But never as a real acoustic event, uninterrupted. It was louder than expected. It was also uncontained. As her human escort led her toward the delegation chambers, he asked a question. Not one of consequence, not one scripted. He asked what kind of music she enjoyed. She did not respond. Not because the question was rude, but because it made no sense. Music was a frequency distortion for psychological reward. It served no practical function. It confused rhythm with logic. She had read their music theory. It read like emotional mathematics written by creatures who feared silence. She did not answer. But behind her eyes, something started to record, not just data, but the absence of structure. The humans moved in unpredictable intervals. Their voices surged and dipped with no obvious correlation to meaning. Their architecture mixed glass and rust and pattern and neglect. There was no uniformity. And yet it didn't collapse. Every second she spent on the ground pressed up against the borders of her instinct for pattern recognition. It was like trying to read a text written by noise. And yet the humans kept reading it aloud to each other, laughing, nodding, dancing, shouting, as if the noise was telling them something real. She followed them inside. The first file on her data slate, Human Cultural Archives, Classification, Music, Subfolder, 20th to 21st Century Expressions. She tapped the first entry. The waveform formed. She did not know the name. Not yet. She would only remember the first line. It's a hard knock life. And she smiled. Not from amusement. Not from joy. But because it was absurd. And because for the first time since her arrival, she didn't know how the next sound would land. She was not prepared for the sound. Not the voices, those she expected. Not the languages, she had learned 20 of them. Not the motion of transit, the swarm of footfalls, or the way buildings reached in uneven defiance of gravity. It was something else. It began as a thrum beneath the concrete, somewhere between a machine hum and a pulse. Then came the layered fragment. Horns from a distant intersection. A chant erupting from a crowd with no clear leader. Music leaking through car doors, storefronts, someone's pocket. None of it coordinated. Every noise cut across another, every rhythm clashed. It should have been chaos. It should have folded under its own weight. It didn't. She followed the escort vehicle through boulevards stained with history. Walls spoke in symbols she hadn't studied. Faces turned, some with curiosity, others without recognition. A child mouthed a word as they passed. Maybe a greeting, maybe not. She registered the motion but didn't respond. The convoy paused for a diplomatic delay. Outside her window, 2 men argued about traffic while a third drummed his fingers on the hood of a cab in perfect time with music playing from a vendor's speaker. None of them acknowledged each other. The rhythm kept going. When they reached the compound, the delegation stood in formation, but not like hers. No symmetry. Their uniforms mismatched in color, some tailored, others not. One official had a tear near the shoulder seam. Another wore sunglasses despite the overcast sky. They looked at her not as a specimen, but as a question. Not hostile. Not reverent. Just uncertain what kind of answer she would be. She stepped down from the vehicle, boots clicking once, twice, no third. The sound vanished into the crowd's murmur. An older woman, skin marked by sunlight and years, stepped forward with the badge of authority and offered no gesture of greeting. Just a sentence. Tell us what you'd like to see first. She answered without pause. Whatever you consider culturally significant. Show me what you are proud of. There was a silence. Not confusion, not offense. Something else. A flick of the eyes between the officials, a shared decision unspoken. The woman raised her chin slightly. Music, she said. The word meant nothing to her in that moment. It had appeared in files, in research nodes, in historical context. But as a living practice, it was shapeless. She imagined ceremony. Or data patterns disguised in rhythm. Something orderly. Something that obeyed intention. They led her into a chamber lined with speakers and relics. Vinyl discs, magnetic tape, luminous displays, instruments both ancient and synthetic. Screens blinked with categorized recordings. She scanned the interface. So many names. None of them filtered by function. No ranking. No hierarchy. Just expressions stacked next to each other, as if volume and emotion belonged on the same shelf. She raised an eyebrow. A gesture she rarely used. Her escort smiled at the reaction. Pick anything, he said. She didn't touch the display. She spoke only once. Choose the one you think explains your kind. He paused. The question carried weight he hadn't expected. His eyes moved across the list, hesitated, tapped a name. She didn't register it. Only the waveform that began to animate. The room filled with a beat that swung low and deliberate. A voice entered, flat, confident, defiant. The phrases came with a bounce, the tone bright but full of scars. She couldn't track the syntax immediately. The rhythms collided with her instincts. She didn't speak. She didn't blink. At the chorus, a children's voice joined the song, not innocent but weary, like an echo of something once pure now reused as armor. She leaned back slightly. Her mouth formed a line. "This is what you are proud of?" she asked. "Yes," he said. She rolled her eyes. Not with disdain. Not with contempt. With disbelief. Because in all her preparation, all her studies, all the simulations and translations and briefings, no one told her humans would use sound like this. Not as decoration. Not as background. As something else entirely. Something they throw forward when words won't carry the weight. The vehicle moved through streets stitched with noise and unfinished sentences. Pedestrians passed with wires in their ears, talking to no one. Horns complained. Doors slammed. Somewhere nearby, someone was singing without shame or skill. Nothing matched. Nothing obeyed tempo. Yet it all moved forward like a machine powered by imbalance. Inside, the cultural liaison tapped the console. Sound filled the cabin without permission. She didn't flinch. She expected rhythm. She expected noise. What she did not expect was the voice of a child, thin, theatrical, carrying a melody built for make-believe. The song began with what sounded like performance for infants, whimsical, soft-edged, designed to comfort. But it was followed, without transition, by a different voice. Older. Male. Weighted. Each word delivered like it had been sharpened. It rode the beat, but refused to soften with it. She frowned. Not at the lyrics. She had not yet parsed them. But at the contrast. It felt unclean. Juvenile parody of suffering, she said, almost to herself. The liaison didn't correct her. He simply let the track continue. The voice kept going. Rhyming pain with defiance. Wrapping hardship in rhythm. Celebrating obstacles like trophies. She blinked once. Slowly. The music had no fixed melody. It did not resolve its own tension. It looped back on itself without reaching harmony. And still it pressed forward. She listened, no longer in protest, but confusion. The refrain returned. The child's voice again. The same melody unchanged. But the context around it had mutated. It was no longer innocent. It was ammunition. Why would they do this? The question was meant to be private. It wasn't. A scientist riding in the front seat turned slightly. "It's from a musical," he said. 1970s. American theater. The story of a girl without parents. Poor. Alone. She sang that song as a way to resist despair. The rapper repurposed it decades later. Made it into something else. She did not respond. He added more, slowly. The contrast is the point. They stack joy on top of struggle, not to mock it, but to make the weight more visible. She shook her head, not in disagreement, but because the explanation only widened the fracture. They weaponize nostalgia, she said. They inject it into their survival narrative. The scientist shrugged. That's one way to see it. She listened again. Not because protocol demanded it. Not because diplomacy required politeness. But because the track lingered in her system like an unresolved equation. The lyrics spoke of failure without apology. Of pressure turned to rhythm. Of a system ignored, outpaced, replaced. No one in the vehicle spoke. The song carried on, alone, undeterred. She exhaled slowly. It wasn't beautiful. It wasn't clean. It was aggressive, defensive, scattered. And it refused to explain itself. That, more than anything, disturbed her. Because art was supposed to translate a people. This did not translate. It confronted. It refused decoding. She turned toward the window. Outside, the buildings leaned into each other like survivors of a war no one won. Street murals covered brickwork that no longer served structural purpose. Children skipped over puddles, shoes unlaced. A man shouted from a rooftop and no one looked up. The song ended. No applause. No summary. Just silence. She said nothing. But her posture had shifted. Slightly. The angle of her head. The position of her hands. She was still recording, but something else had begun. She wasn't listening for information anymore. She was listening for intention. The conference wing was a corridor of nervous hands and practiced lines. Screens pulsed with shifting numbers. Diplomats rehearsed phrases that had been approved weeks earlier but would collapse under a single unexpected question. The air was thick with restraint. No outbursts, no raised voices, only the precision of managed expectations. She watched them from the observation deck. She wasn't meant to speak, only to witness. To understand how Earth conducted itself under pressure. They had selected their finest. That much was obvious. Languages moved between them like baton passes, each tone adjusted to match audience and moment. Faces tight, breaths measured. Every motion carved for diplomacy. She expected this. It matched the briefings. What did not match came from the walls. Music again. Not for ceremony. Not for show. For momentum. Someone in the back had connected a speaker to an old device. The track wasn't for guests. It wasn't part of the itinerary. It belonged to the people preparing to speak for Earth. It bled through the floor like adrenaline. A beat struck without subtlety. Heavy, deliberate, fast. Like footsteps that didn't hesitate. The first sound was already a challenge. It didn't ask to be welcomed. It landed like a signal. A voice followed. Clip. Controlled. On the edge of losing control. She stood straighter. The rhythm refused to stabilize. The voice chased it, caught it, broke it, rebuilt it. Each line snapped forward, only to break off before it could be completed. Momentum was everything. No melody. No harmony. Just raw propulsion. She narrowed her eyes. The human next to her whispered a name. Eminem. She didn't respond. There were no layers of composition. No soaring structure. No predictable turn. The entire song surged like it had something to outrun. But it never slowed. Not once. She could not catch the meaning. The words came too fast. But the tone, there was no need for translation. Urgency. Compression. A threat pointed inward. The diplomat rehearsing below stumbled. Pause. Breathed. Then started again. The track continued. It did not adjust to accommodate him. It forced him to meet its pace. She blinked. This was not music. This was a weapon held to the head of hesitation. A dare. A warning. A confession. The line repeated. Lose yourself. The phrase made no sense as advice. And yet it struck like a warning siren just before the hull breaches. The song ended. The training continued. No one commented. No one seemed changed. But she was. In the quarters they had assigned her, the silence felt wrong. Measured, still, obedient. The kind of silence that used to comfort her. That once framed thought like lines around a shape. She requested the track again. Just that one. It began. She sat. The first beat arrived, same as before. She noticed its posture now. How it swung wide to make room for the words. The voice didn't wait for permission. It lunged at the tempo like it had teeth. She replayed it. A second time, she counted breaths between lines. There were barely any. As if the speaker refused to give the silence a chance to respond. She replayed it. A third time, she tried to map the cadence to a standard rhythm. It didn't fit. It pushed against every schema she applied. It moved like thought under pressure. Like truth trying to escape before it got buried. Something in her shifted. Not much. Not visible. But the silence after the third play felt heavier. She sat motionless for several minutes. The song was not designed to soothe. It was designed to drag something to the surface and force it to stand alone. She understood nothing of the lyrics, but something inside her had flinched. She didn't ask for the next track. She demanded it. Her voice was sharper than before, stripped of pretense, her phrasing clipped, deliberate. The assistant hesitated at first. Not because the request was improper, but because her tone left no room for delay. He keyed in the selection and waited. She offered no gesture of thanks. The beat began, slow, heavy, deliberate. The texture of it was unfamiliar. It moved like memory half buried beneath stone. A voice entered, measured, self-assured, unforgiving. No attempt at flattery. No intention to entertain. Just lines carved into rhythm like statements from a courtroom where the verdict had already been handed down. She leaned forward. The phrases were plain, but the message was concealed. That much was obvious. Each word sat in a layer of meaning that demanded excavation. On the surface, names, money, status. Beneath it, something else. Not quite anger. Not quite pride. A dissection. She paused the playback midline. Asked the assistant to explain. He looked uncomfortable. She repeated the question. He started with the basics. Race. History. The legacy of classification. The visual hierarchies embedded in law and culture. The speaker in the song wasn't announcing an identity. He was dragging one into the light, not to celebrate it, but to question its use. She said nothing. Replayed the same 30 seconds. Stopped it again. The assistant tried to elaborate. She cut him off. Requested reference material. He gave her a digital library link, unsure if she would bother. She consumed 5 books in 2 hours. 4 documentaries. A sociological archive on American redlining. A statistical analysis on generational wealth disparity. A lecture on cultural commodification. Another on the criminalization of identity. She returned to the track. This time she didn't blink. The metaphors unfolded now, but not like keys to a riddle. They struck like verdicts. There were no soft corners. Each bar was a refusal to be confused with decoration. She replayed a line where a racial epithet was spoken flatly, followed by a list of variations, each describing success, each chained to the same root. It wasn't a lament. It was a coded diagram of survival. She said nothing aloud. Her breath had slowed. Her posture locked. The track moved on to economic references. Stocks. Property. Value framed as control. Generational wealth mentioned not as fortune but as strategy. Each line revealed a layer of system dressed in personal anecdote. This was not disorder. This was encrypted rebellion. She did not know whether to be impressed or afraid. She had assumed emotion was Earth's currency. That they traded in sentiment because precision eluded them. But this was the opposite of chaos. The speaker wasn't emoting. He was calculating, slicing through the illusions of equality with language honed to wound. The final line landed. Not shouted. Not emphasized. Just placed. As if the speaker trusted that the truth would do the cutting without help. The room was quiet. She did not move. She did not speak. Because what she had just heard was not an artifact. It was an instruction manual for how a people survive a system designed to forget them. She hadn't intended to hear it. The archive was broad, poorly sorted, cluttered with open-access files and mislabeled recordings. She was searching for economic data, cultural models, something quantifiable. The interface was clumsy. It pushed content forward without hierarchy. A video began before she could stop it. She didn't know the name. She recognized the voice. It started with a whisper. Measured, rhythmic, almost weary. A voice tracing its own thoughts as if walking them back from somewhere dangerous. She assumed it was improvisational. Another human compulsion for self-expression. But the tempo was too consistent. The imagery too precise. A man in a room. A performance being prepared. She almost moved on. But something held her. The tone was wrong for performance. There was no escalation. No climax. The details were specific. Routine. A light check. A crowd anticipated. A sense of ritual, but not for art. For execution. She listened. Lines repeated. The voice grew no louder. There was no spectacle, just narrowing focus. He described his own breath, the silence before noise. What seemed like anxiety began to take on structure. The list of actions wasn't preparation for stagecraft. It was a method, a plan. The words turned. Not abruptly, not loudly, just with the precision of someone who had already crossed the threshold and had no need to explain why. The second voice began. She realized it wasn't another person. It was the same voice, but now it was the audience, the witness, the one left behind. Her hands stilled. The metaphors dropped away. There were no riddles, no shield of bravado. The first voice had entered a place the second one could not follow. The crowd, the lights, the space, all of it shifted meaning in retrospect. He wasn't performing. He was confessing. And then it arrived. The line that closed the circle. The revelation she hadn't been looking for. The man wasn't preparing for a show. He was preparing for an act of violence. She froze. Not out of shock, but because her body didn't know how to respond. No warning tone. No formal escalation. Just thought laid over motive, laid over action. The story folded inward. She replayed the final verse, once, then again. Each time, her understanding changed. The meaning didn't shift, but her position in it did. This was not performance. It was a reconstruction. A reenactment of a moment no one wanted to remember, told by someone who knew it too well. She stood abruptly. Not from protocol. Not from dignity. Something in her structure could not remain still. She crossed the corridor without notice. The diplomatic session had already begun. Earth and Andari officials exchanged controlled pleasantries, formalities, future trade. Her chair remained empty. She entered, stepped forward, stopped. The room noticed. Slowly. Her presence was always calculated, always measured. But something had changed. It wasn't in her expression. It was in the stillness beneath it. A delegate addressed her. Asked if she had something to contribute. She didn't speak. Because there was nothing to translate. She turned. Walked out. No explanation. No debriefing. No apology. Because what she had just heard was not debate. Not disagreement. Not diplomacy. It was an act of memory so raw it refused to be shaped. It did not ask to be understood. It only demanded to be witnessed. She sealed the door without ceremony. No staff were summoned. No messages replied to. She entered the override code for isolation and disabled the ambient filters that softened external noise. The room accepted her withdrawal with silence. The console waited. She typed with precision. One title. No variations. No curated playlist. No softened version. She selected the original. Pressed play. The opening lines arrived in a tone that almost mimicked routine. A voice speaking as if through paper, informal, unresolved. The rhythm was calm. The content was not. A letter. A fan. Reaching out. Trying to be heard. The words were crowded. Not angry. Just tight. Desperate for space. She sat upright. Hands clasped. Not in reverence. In readiness. Each verse added pressure. A man writing to someone who didn't answer. Documenting everything he had done to earn notice. Compliments slipped into grievances. Complaints wrapped in praise. She didn't blink. The song did not escalate. It accumulated. Details were layered, not emphasized. They simply appeared. One after another. Like bricks being stacked. No warning. No crescendo. Just wait. By the second letter, the pattern was clear. The speaker was unraveling. His language became fragmented. His tone sharpened. Accusations began to hide behind anecdote. Apologies collided with threats. Her breath shortened. The voice changed. Same artist. Different posture. The recipient speaks. Late. Too late. Calm. Honest. He explains the delay. He explains the intent. And the twist arrives. Quietly. No drums. No sting. The fan is already dead. The reply came after the act. She paused the recording. Not because she needed rest. Because something inside her would not let it continue without acknowledgement. She replayed it from the beginning. Listened not as a diplomat. Not as a scholar. As something else. A child. Her mind returned to stories once taught and later retracted. Songs her ancestors had written in secret, banned after the first cultural purge. Chants recorded by dissidents before being erased from the archive. She remembered the tone of forbidden voices, how they whispered through the corridors of youth, always accompanied by warnings. Emotion was once legal in her world. Until it wasn't. Expression once taught in schools. Until it wasn't. She had read of this in footnotes, seen fragments in redacted files. This song was not about Earth. Not only. It was about the silence that forms when voices are ignored long enough to rot. It was about obsession misnamed as loyalty. Pain misfiled as devotion. It was about what happens when people write their names in ink and are never read. The music did not fade. It stopped. Abrupt. No outro. Just absence. Her body trembled. Not visibly, but deep where her bones met memory. She stood without intention. Not to pace. Not to prepare. Just to move, because remaining still felt like disobedience to the thing she had just witnessed. There was no glossary for this. No chart. No metric. Only a truth that struck without asking for her permission. This was not a song. It was a consequence. She was no longer searching. There was no query, no keyword, no data objective. The interface remained open, waiting for direction. Her fingers hovered, unmoving. Her eyes fixed on the screen but looking past it. She was not lost. She was emptied. Not by confusion. By the removal of something she had never named. Her hand moved. The next track was not recommended. It was not in sequence. It appeared because the system remembered what she had chosen before. A simple title. 3 numbers. No genre label. No preview. She selected it. Not because she expected understanding. Because she no longer expected anything. The voice began. No introduction. No beat. No rhythm to carry it. No instrument to shield it. Just a man. Alone. Speaking in the raw shape of song. She recognized the cadence, but this was not the voice she had heard before. The earlier tracks carried pride, sharpness, resistance. This voice carried something else. Not weakness. Not sorrow. Something without weapon. Something stripped down to language and weight. He wasn't performing. He was confessing. Line by line, the truth unfolded, not for judgment, not for defense. Just truth, laid bare with no armor. The words trembled without trembling. He spoke of betrayal, of failure, of the damage done by silence, of love withheld and finally named too late. Her breath stilled. She knew apology in the diplomatic sense, the ceremonial kind, the official language that acknowledged offense without admitting fault. This was not that. This was a man breaking himself open in the hope that something honest might survive the collapse. There was no demand in his voice. No request to be forgiven. Only the desperate shape of a man who finally understood the wound he had caused and the silence it left behind. She did not blink. Her throat tightened. He spoke of family. Of trust broken in private and exposed in public. Of his own voice failing when it mattered. There was no crescendo. No redemption arc. Just admission. The final line arrived not with force, but with finality. He didn't explain it. He just allowed it to exist. Her body shifted. Skin changed without instruction. Color drained from her face and returned as something new. Patterns moved beneath the surface. Slow, deliberate, irreversible. It was the Andari way. No sobs. No tears. Just change. No one would hear it from outside the room. But anyone who saw her now would know. She had wept. Not from pain. Not from shame. But because something in her had finally recognized its own reflection in another being's regret. This was not a concession. It was not surrender. It was not admiration for human expression. It was the moment she understood that evolution could come from apology. That power could exist in vulnerability. That silence was not always strength. This was not domination. This was growth. The transmission began without protocol. No diplomatic header. No encryption sequence. No preamble. It arrived stripped of formality, outside the rhythm of expected channels. The signal was authenticated, but the content carried no defense report, no political analysis, no trade viability matrix. The file was untagged. The header contained a single word. Observations. The council chamber received it in silence. 37 advisors, 10 ministers, 5 cultural interpreters, and a monitor from the High Court waited. They expected metric, resource potential, linguistic structures, threat assessments, proposals for controlled exchange. They did not receive them. The first sound was a voice. Not hers. Not translated. The original, raw, clip, delivered over a beat that struck like steel against wet ground. It lasted 13 seconds. Cut. Another voice followed, faster, jagged, spinning through phrases with no breath, each line pushing against the next as if the speaker's own pulse outran the words. Cut. A different tone. Smoother. Calculated. Delivered with the calm of someone slicing through doctrine. Cut. The final voice came with no rhythm, no decoration, no armor. Just words carried like broken stone in open hands. Confession. Regret. Closure without resolution. 90 seconds. 4 voices. No explanation. Silence followed. She appeared on screen. Not seated. Not standing. Not arranged in posture. She spoke without movement, the way the condemned speak when everything has already been said and nothing will be taken back. Her report is short. She states no recommendation. She names no strategic path forward. She speaks of no treaty. She lists no threat. Her final words are measured. Plain. You feared their violence. You should have feared their art. The signal ends. No summary follows. No justification. No return message is requested. The chamber remains still. The file remains unclosed. There is no decryption needed. They heard her. Thank you for watching and sticking with me to the end. Now, if you believe humanity deserves a future among the stars, do subscribe now. Only those who'd abandon Earth to its fate will scroll past.